In July of 1928, in a hotel in the Belgian seaside town of Ostend, a group of men gathered around a table to sign a document that would shape the destiny of millions of people who would never know their names. They were not heads of state. They were not generals. They were not diplomats, at least not officially. They were oilmen, representatives of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, Royal Dutch Shell, Compagnie Française de Pétrole, and a consortium of American oil giants calling itself the Near East Development Corporation. And sitting among them, quiet and watchful, was a 60-year-old Armenian financier named Calouste Gulbenkian, who held no army, no navy, no government behind him, just a 5% stake in a company that controlled the most valuable piece of earth on the planet. On that day, these 5 entities divided the richest petroleum territories on earth among themselves, drew a line on a map, and agreed that no one else, no government, no rival company, no outside interest of any kind would be allowed in. The people who actually lived on top of that oil, the Arabs, the Kurds, the Turkmen, were not in the room. They were not consulted. They were not even considered. And the consequences of what happened in that room are still reverberating across the Middle East right now, nearly a century later. Now, most people, if they have heard of the Red Line Agreement at all, think of it as some obscure piece of oil industry trivia, a corporate footnote, a business deal between companies that no longer exist. But here's the thing. This was not just a business deal. This was the moment when Western corporations, backed by Western governments, carved up an entire region of the world and locked it into a system of extraction that would define its politics, its borders, and its conflicts for generations. It was the moment when the Middle East stopped belonging to the people who lived there and started belonging to the people who could drill. And to understand how 5 entities ended up in a room in Belgium dividing a region that none of them had any natural claim to, you have to follow the money, not to 1928, much further back. Back to a time when oil was not yet the most valuable substance on Earth, but a few men already understood that it was about to be. So let us go back. To the year 1901, the place is Persia, modern-day Iran. A wealthy British-Australian businessman named William Knox D'Arcy traveled to Tehran and negotiated a concession with the Shah, Mozaffar ad-Din Shah Qajar, that was staggering in its scope. For the sum of £20,000 in cash, another £20,000 in shares of the future company, and a promise of 16% of net profits, D'Arcy secured exclusive rights to explore and drill for oil across 480,000 square miles of Persian territory. Let that number sit for a moment. 480,000 square miles. That is roughly 3/4 of the entire country, an area larger than France and Germany combined, handed to one man for what amounted to loose change in the ledgers of European finance. The Shah needed the money. D'Arcy had it. And the terms of that exchange would set the template for every Western oil concession in the Middle East for the next 6 decades. For years, the drilling produced nothing. D'Arcy burned through more than £225,000. He was on the verge of abandoning the whole venture when, on May 26, 1908, at a site called Masjid-i-Suleiman in the foothills of southwestern Persia, the drill bit found what D'Arcy had been searching for: oil. A massive gusher that announced to the world that the Middle East was sitting on petroleum reserves of almost unimaginable scale. By 1909, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company had been formed to exploit it, backed by the Burma Oil Company. The age of Middle Eastern oil had begun, but the question that would define the next century was already forming in the minds of strategists in London, Paris, Berlin, and Washington. Who would control it? Now, this is where a man named Winston Churchill enters the story, and not in the role most people associate with him. In 1911, Churchill became First Lord of the Admiralty, the political head of the Royal Navy. And he faced a decision that, while it rarely appears in the popular histories of the 20th century, arguably shaped the modern world more than any single military engagement of its time. The Royal Navy, the most powerful military force on the planet, the instrument that held the British Empire together across oceans and continents, ran on coal, Welsh coal. Reliable, abundant, domestic. But oil-powered ships were faster. 25 knots compared to 21 for the best coal-burning dreadnoughts. They could be refueled at sea by tanker instead of spending days in port with thousands of men shoveling coal into bunkers. They needed fewer stokers in the engine room, freeing up space for armor and guns. In a naval arms race with Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany that was growing more dangerous by the month, these advantages could mean the difference between ruling the seas and losing them. The problem was obvious and enormous. Britain had mountains of coal beneath its own soil. It had no oil, not a single commercially viable well on the British Isles. Converting the Royal Navy to oil meant making the most important military force in the British Empire permanently dependent on a resource that existed in commercially viable quantities, almost entirely in the Middle East and in territories controlled by rivals. Churchill understood the risk with perfect clarity. He told Parliament that if Britain could not secure oil, it could not secure corn, cotton, or the 1,001 commodities necessary for the preservation of the economic energies of the nation. Security meant supply. Supply meant ownership. And ownership meant the British government had to stop treating oil as a private commodity and start treating it as a strategic asset of the state. In June of 1914, just weeks before the First World War erupted across Europe, Churchill convinced Parliament to purchase a 51% controlling stake in the Anglo-Persian oil company for £2.2 million. Let me say that again because it matters. The British government, the government of the world's largest empire, bought majority ownership in a private oil company. It was not acting as a regulator. It was not collecting taxes. It was an owner, a shareholder, a direct commercial participant in the extraction of Middle Eastern petroleum. And from that moment forward, British foreign policy in the Middle East and British oil interests became one and the same thing. The line between the state and the corporation dissolved, and it never came back. Now, running alongside Churchill's strategic maneuvering was another story. The story of a man who understood the game better than anyone else alive, and who would eventually draw the most consequential line on a map in the 20th century. Calouste Gulbenkian. Born in 1869 in the Scutari district of Constantinople to a wealthy Armenian family with connections to the Caucasian oil trade, Gulbenkian was brilliant, secretive, and possessed an almost preternatural ability to see where history was heading before anyone else caught on. He studied petroleum engineering at King's College London and, at the age of just 25, published a detailed technical analysis of the oil potential of Mesopotamia, the Ottoman provinces of Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra, modern-day Iraq. At a time when the Ottoman authorities viewed petroleum as a minor curiosity, when most European investors could not have found Mosul on a map, Gulbenkian already knew what was buried under the desert. He concluded that these territories were sitting on reserves that could rival anything in Persia or the Americas, and he spent the next 2 decades positioning himself to profit from that knowledge. Gulbenkian served as an economic and financial advisor to the Ottoman embassies in Paris and London. He had 1 foot in the Ottoman world and 1 foot in European high finance, and he used that unique position to broker a deal that would make him one of the richest men on earth. Between 1911 and 1912, Gulbenkian was instrumental in founding the Turkish Petroleum Company, or TPC. He brought together the British-controlled National Bank of Turkey, Deutsche Bank representing German commercial interests, and Royal Dutch Shell under the formidable Sir Henry Deterding, a man the industry called the Napoleon of oil. Together, they secured a concession from the Ottoman government covering the oil-rich provinces of Mesopotamia. Gulbenkian arranged the deal, balanced the competing national interests, navigated the Ottoman bureaucracy, and for his trouble, took a 5% personal stake in the company. 5%. It does not sound like much, but 5% of the largest undeveloped oil concession in the Middle East would eventually generate hundreds of millions of dollars in royalties over a lifetime. They called him Mr. 5%. And he never set foot in Iraq, not once in his entire life. Then the First World War happened, and everything changed. The Ottoman Empire, which had controlled the Middle Eastern territories for 4 centuries, allied with Germany and the Central Powers, and lost. The empire was dismantled. Its provinces were carved up by the victorious powers, primarily Britain and France, under the polite fiction of League of Nations mandates. And here is where the story gets deeply uncomfortable, because the carving was not about freedom or self-determination or any of the noble principles that Woodrow Wilson was proclaiming from his podium in Paris. It was about oil. In April of 1920, at the San Remo Conference on the Italian Riviera, Britain and France quietly divided the Ottoman oil territories between themselves. Germany's former 25% share in the Turkish Petroleum Company was seized as enemy property and handed to France, specifically to a newly created company called Compagnie Française de Pétrole, or CFP. Britain took control of Mesopotamia as a League of Nations mandate. France got Syria and Lebanon. In exchange for recognizing British dominance over Iraqi oil, France received its quarter share of TPC and a promise that a pipeline would be built through French-mandated Syria to carry Iraqi crude to the Mediterranean coast. The borders of the modern Middle East were being drawn, and the pencil was guided not by the wishes of the people who lived within those borders, but by the location of oil deposits and the route requirements of pipelines. The Americans were not in the room at San Remo. They had not been consulted, and they were furious. American oil companies had been completely shut out of the richest petroleum territory on Earth, despite the fact that the United States had contributed significantly to the Allied victory. Over 100,000 American soldiers had died in Europe, and now Britain and France were dividing the economic spoils without even acknowledging their former allies' interests. The U.S. State Department, first under Secretary Bainbridge Colby and then under the formidable Charles Evans Hughes, launched a sustained diplomatic offensive. They invoked the open door policy, the principle that all nations should have equal commercial access to the former Ottoman territories held under international mandate. The argument was simple and devastating. These were not British or French territories. They were mandates held in trust under international law, and the United States had every right to participate in their economic development. The Americans backed their diplomacy with economic leverage. They threatened to deny British oil companies access to American domestic reserves and markets at a time when the United States was still the world's largest oil producer. The pressure worked. By 1922, the British grudgingly agreed to allow American companies into the TPC consortium. 7 American oil companies formed the Near East Development Corporation to negotiate their entry. The negotiations dragged on for 6 years, marked by bitter disagreements over share allocations, voting rights, and operational control. By 1928, only 2 American companies remained at the table: Standard Oil of New Jersey, under its president Walter Teagle, and Socony Vacuum. The others had dropped out, unwilling to accept the restrictive terms that Gulbenkian and the Europeans insisted upon. And this brings us back to Ostend, July 31st, 1928. Now, just months before the agreement was signed, in October of 1927, the Turkish Petroleum Company had struck oil at Baba Gurgur near Kirkuk in northern Iraq. The well blew with such force that it produced an estimated 95,000 barrels per day, one of the largest gushers in history up to that point. It took 8.5 days to bring it under control. The discovery confirmed what Gulbenkian had predicted 3 decades earlier. Iraq was sitting on a sea of oil. And suddenly, the negotiations at Ostend were not about hypothetical reserves. They were about dividing a proven fortune. The agreement restructured the Turkish Petroleum Company. The ownership was divided into 4 equal shares of 23.75% each. Anglo-Persian Oil Company, Royal Dutch Shell, Compagnie Française des Pétroles, the American Near East Development Corporation, and Gulbenkian, still holding his 5%, collected through a separate beneficiary arrangement, 4 corporate giants backed by 4 governments, and 1 Armenian middleman who had engineered the entire enterprise from a desk in Paris 2 decades earlier. But the share split was not the most important part of the agreement. The most important part was the map. According to the account preserved by the historian Daniel Jurgen in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book The Prize, Gulbenkian picked up a red pencil and drew a thick line on a map of the Middle East. The line traced the boundaries of the old Ottoman Empire as he remembered them from his years as an advisor to the Sultan. It encompassed modern-day Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and most of the Arabian Peninsula. Jurgen called it one of the most extraordinary international business arrangements of the 20th century. And then came the clause that made it all work, the self-denying clause, sometimes called the self-denying ordinance. It stated, in language that left no room for ambiguity, that no signatory could independently seek or develop oil concessions within the territory enclosed by that red line. Any oil opportunity inside the line had to be offered to all partners. Everyone participated or no one moved. There would be no competition within the red line, no freelancing, no going behind the backs of your partners. Now, let me make sure the full weight of this registers. 5 entities, 4 corporations, and 1 individual had just agreed that the entire oil wealth of a region stretching from Turkey to the tip of the Arabian Peninsula belonged to them. Collectively, exclusively. The nations that sat on top of that oil, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, the territories that would become Saudi Arabia, had no meaningful voice in who would extract their most valuable natural resource, how much they would be paid for it, or where it would go. This was not a free market. This was a cartel, pure and simple, and it was backed, directly and indirectly, by the full diplomatic and military weight of the British, French, and American governments. The Turkish Petroleum Company was renamed the Iraq Petroleum Company in 1929, and it operated not as a normal profit-seeking corporation, but as what the industry called a cost company. It produced oil and sold it to its parent companies at a fixed low cost. The parent companies then sold that oil on world markets at whatever price the market would bear, keeping the profit for themselves. By carefully controlling Iraqi production, the parent companies could manage global supply, keep prices artificially stable, and ensure that cheap Iraqi oil did not flood their own markets and undermine their other holdings. Iraq received royalties, but always far less than the true market value of its resources. The country that owned the oil was, in economic terms, a tenant in its own house. And here is a detail that would prove enormously consequential. The red line excluded 2 places: Kuwait, which Britain considered a separate protectorate and not part of the Ottoman Empire as Gulbenkian defined it, and Iran, which had never been Ottoman territory. Those 2 exclusions, which seemed like minor geographical quibbles in 1928, would reshape the entire global oil industry within 2 decades. Now, just weeks after the Red Line Agreement was signed, the story got even more extraordinary. In September of 1928, the heads of the 3 largest oil companies in the world, Sir Henry de Turding of Shell, Walter Teagle of Standard Oil of New Jersey, and Sir John Cadman of Anglo-Persian, met secretly at Achnacarry Castle in the Scottish Highlands. The cover story was a grouse hunting holiday. The reality was something else entirely. They signed what became known as the As-Is Agreement, sometimes called the Achnacary Agreement. It froze global market shares at their current levels. It coordinated pricing to eliminate what they delicately called ruinous competition. It established frameworks for sharing pipelines, tankers, and refining infrastructure. In plain language, the three most powerful oil companies on Earth agreed not to compete with each other. Anywhere. The Red Line Agreement had carved up the Middle East. The Achnacary Agreement carved up the world. Anthony Sampson, in his landmark book The Seven Sisters, argued that these twin agreements created a system of corporate control over sovereign resources that had no precedent in human history. And the men who controlled the flow of oil, the substance that powered every navy, every army, every factory, every automobile, every power plant in the industrialized world, had decided among themselves that they would set the price, control the supply, and divide the profits. Now, the Red Line Agreement was designed to be permanent, a structure that would hold the oil industry in equilibrium forever. It did not last 2 decades. And the reason it fell apart reveals something fundamental about the nature of cartels. They work until one member sees an opportunity too large to share. In 1933, Standard Oil of California, a company that was not a signatory to the Red Line Agreement, obtained a 60-year oil concession directly from King Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia. In 1936, they brought in Texaco as a partner, and together they formed what would become the Arabian-American Oil Company, Aramco. And then, in 1938, they struck oil at a well called Dammam No. 7. The reserves turned out to be almost beyond human comprehension. Saudi Arabia was sitting on the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, reserves that would eventually be measured at over 260 billion barrels, more than any other country on Earth. Standard Oil of New Jersey and Sakhni Vacuum, both signatories to the Red Line Agreement, looked at Saudi Arabia and saw the future of the industry. They wanted in, desperately. But the self-denying clause stood directly in their way. Saudi Arabia was inside the Red Line. They could not independently pursue oil development there without offering the opportunity to all their IPC partners, Anglo-Persian, Shell, CFP, and Gulbenkian. Sharing Saudi Arabia with the Europeans and with Gulbenkian was unthinkable. The Americans wanted Saudi oil for themselves. So they did what powerful corporations have always done when a contract becomes an obstacle to profit. They found a way to break it. They argued that the Red Line Agreement had been invalidated during the Second World War because Compagnie Française de Pétrole, under the Vichy government and then under German occupation, had become an enemy entity. The agreement, they claimed, had been voided by the force of war. It was a legal argument of convenience, and everyone in the room knew it. Gulbenkian, by then in his late 70s, was apoplectic. He called it a betrayal of the most fundamental kind. CFP launched legal challenges across multiple jurisdictions. But the Americans had the weight of the United States government behind them. The State Department supported the dissolution. The strategic calculation was clear. Whoever controlled Saudi oil would control the post-war energy order. And Washington was not about to let that prize fall to a European consortium governed by a 20-year-old agreement drafted by an Armenian middleman in Belgium. In November of 1948, after years of legal and diplomatic warfare, the Red Line Agreement was formally dissolved. Standard Oil of New Jersey and Sakhni Vacuum bought into Aramco, creating the famous four-partner consortium. Standard Oil of California with 30%, Texaco with 30%, Jersey Standard with 30%, and Sakhni Vacuum with 10%. 4 American companies now controlled the oil reserves of Saudi Arabia, the largest energy prize in history. Make of that what you will. And here's where the story connects directly to the world you are living in right now. The resentment created by decades of Western corporate control over Middle Eastern oil did not disappear when the agreements expired or when the companies changed their names. It metastasized. Iran nationalized its oil industry under Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in 1951, and the British and Americans responded by overthrowing his democratically elected government in a CIA and MI6 coup in 1953, installing the Shah and restoring Western oil access. Iraq nationalized the Iraq Petroleum Company in 1972, seizing the very concession that had been carved up at Ostend 44 years earlier. Saudi Arabia gradually took over Aramco through a series of buy-ins, completing full nationalization by 1980. And in 1960, 5 oil-producing nations, tired of having their most valuable resource priced and allocated by foreign corporations sitting in boardrooms in London and New York, formed OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. OPEC was, in many ways, the mirror image of the Red Line Agreement. It was the producing nations doing to the consuming nations precisely what the consuming nations had done to them for half a century, forming a cartel, controlling supply, setting the price. The petrodollar system, the arrangement struck in 1974 between Henry Kissinger and King Faisal, by which Saudi Arabia agreed to price all its oil exclusively in U.S. dollars in exchange for American military protection. traces its roots directly back to these agreements. The borders drawn across the Middle East after the First World War, borders that sliced through tribal territories, separated communities, and created nations that had never existed before, were drawn in large part to facilitate oil extraction and pipeline routes. The conflicts that have consumed the region for a century, the coups, the invasions, the civil wars, the revolutions, the occupations, have all played out on a map that was shaped, in ways most people never learn about, by 5 entities sitting in a room in Belgium in 1928, dividing the earth beneath other people's feet. The uncomfortable truth is this: the modern Middle East was not shaped primarily by the people who lived there. It was shaped by the people who wanted what was under their soil. Not by generals, but by oilmen. Not on battlefields, but in boardrooms. Not through declarations of war, but through concession agreements, pipeline routes, and self-denying clauses. And the line that Calouste Gulbenkian drew with a red pencil on a map in Ostend, the line that enclosed the old Ottoman Empire and everything beneath it, that line has never really been erased. It has just been redrawn, again and again, by different hands in different rooms, for exactly the same reason, because whoever controls the oil controls the map, and whoever controls the map controls the future. If this story changed how you think about the Middle East, about oil, about who really draws the lines on the maps that shape our world, I would ask you to subscribe to this channel. We trace the financial forces behind the events that history textbooks leave out, the money behind the wars, the deals behind the borders, the boardrooms behind the battlefields. Drop a like if this shifted your perspective, and leave a comment telling me which part of this story surprised you the most. Was it Gulbenkian and his 5%? The self-denying clause? The Achnacarry Castle meeting? The way the Americans broke the agreement to get Saudi oil? I read every single one, and I am genuinely curious what you took from it. I will see you in the next one.